Rescuers found Richard Voss's ice axe planted perfectly upright in the snow at 8,200 meters on K2, like a grave marker someone had set with care. 2 meters below it, his daughter Elena was buried, with her arm stretched toward the surface, fingers open wide. She didn't even want to be on that mountain, so why did she die there? Rescuers found Richard Voss's ice axe planted perfectly upright in the snow at 8,200 meters, like someone had placed it there on purpose. It stood straight and still against the gray sky, surrounded by nothing but white. The rescue team leader, a veteran Balti climber named Sadiq Karim, said later that it stopped him cold. He had recovered bodies on K2 before, but this axe was planted with care. It took the team another 20 minutes to realize what it was marking. 2 meters below the surface, and Elena Voss lay curled on her side, one arm extended straight above her head, fingers spread wide. She had been trying to dig her way out. She almost made it. To understand how a woman who never wanted to be on K2 ended up buried under its snow, you have to go back 18 months. You have to go back to a kitchen table in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where a 61-year-old retired structural engineer named Richard Voss unrolled a topographic map and told his daughter he was going to climb the second highest mountain on Earth. Elena Voss was 34 years old. She worked as an environmental consultant. She ran half marathons on weekends. She was fit and careful and practical in the way that people who spend a lot of time outdoors tend to be. She had climbed Mount Rainier with a guide service 2 summers before, and she had trekked in Patagonia the year after that. She was not a technical climber. She was not a high-altitude specialist. She was a daughter who looked at her father's face across that kitchen table and understood immediately that nothing she said was going to change his mind. Richard had summited Kilimanjaro at 55. He had reached the top of Aconcagua at 58 through deep snow and brutal wind. Those 2 climbs had not satisfied him. They had fed something in him instead, something that grew the more he gave it. He had been talking about K2 for 3 years. He had a folder on his laptop with photographs of the Abruzzi Spur going back to the 1950s. He talked about the bottleneck the way other men his age talked about golf courses. He knew the names of every climber who had died there. He knew K, 2 kills, roughly 1 in every 4 who reach its summit. He knew all of it, and none of it slowed him down. Elena agreed to go under one condition. She would be his climbing partner. Not a separate client, not a different rope team. His partner. If she said turn back, they turned back. Richard smiled and said yes. He meant it when he said it. They signed with Summit Bridge Expeditions, which operated out of Islamabad and ran 3 K2 commercial teams per season. The cost for a fully guided attempt was $78,000 per climber, covering permits, logistics, Sherpa support, fixed rope installation on the upper mountain, and 4 acclimatization rotations from base camp. Richard paid for both of them without blinking. Their lead guide was a man named Nawang Rai, who had summited K2 11 times and guided the mountain for 14 seasons. He was 42 years old, quiet in the way that very competent people tend to be, and he had a habit of watching clients for the first 3 days before saying much. He watched Richard and Elena for 3 days, then pulled Elena aside near the mess tent on the 4th morning. Your father is strong, Nawang told her, but he listens to himself more than he listens to the mountain. I want you to know that. Elena said she knew. She said she was there to help manage that. Nawang nodded slowly. He did not look reassured. Base camp on K2 sits at 5,000 meters at the foot of the Godwin-Austen Glacier in Pakistan's Karakoram Range. The glacier shifts and groans at night like something enormous turning in its sleep. The cold comes down off the upper mountain in waves even in July. Prayer flags strung between tents crack and snap like small whips. The altitude gives most people headaches for the first week, and the air carries a smell of ice and stone that has no match anywhere at lower elevation. They completed their first rotation in late June, climbing to Camp 1 at 6,000 meters and back. Richard struggled on the descent, his knees aching from the steep, loose rock of the lower Abruzzi Spur. He did not mention this to Nawang. He mentioned it to Elena, who told the team physician, who recommended anti-inflammatory medication and stretching. Richard took the medication for 2 days and then stopped. Jürgen Albrecht, a German climber who shared a tent with them at Camp 3 during their third rotation, Bobby later described Richard to investigators. He talked about the mountain like it owed him something. He had paid for it, he had trained for it, and now he expected it to cooperate. The daughter was different. She was always watching him, watching the sky, watching Nawang's face for signs. He paused before adding, she saw everything. She just couldn't act on any of it. By late July, Summit Bridge's weather service had identified a 5-day stable window, opening July 28th. Nawang reviewed the forecast 3 times. He told Richard and Elena the window was real but narrow, and a second weather system was building to the northwest. He recommended they begin their summit push on July 29th, giving the first day of the window time to fully establish. Richard said July 28th. He had a flight back to Pittsburgh booked for August 5th. Nawang looked at Elena. Elena looked at her father. She said nothing. Jürgen Albrecht was at Camp 3 when Richard and Elena passed through at 4 in the morning on July 28th. He offered Richard a cup of tea and said the stars looked wrong to him, too still in a way that sometimes meant pressure dropping. Richard thanked him and kept moving. Elena stopped briefly. Albrecht recalled, she looked at me for a moment, just looked. Then she turned and followed her father up into the dark. I think she knew. I think she had known for a long time. At 12:40 p.m., Nawang radioed base camp. He reported that conditions were changing faster than forecast. The wind at 8,000 meters had picked up sharply in the past hour. Visibility was dropping. He had spoken to Richard about slowing the pace. Richard had told him they were fine. At 1:15 p.m., the second weather system arrived 6 hours early. The wind hit them like a wall. One moment, Elena could see the fixed rope stretching 20 meters above her, yellow against the gray-white slope. The next moment, there was nothing. The cloud swallowed K2 whole, and the world shrank to a circle about 3 meters wide. And inside that circle, there was only blowing snow and the sound of her own breathing loud inside her balaclava, and the shape of her father 4 steps ahead of her, already slowing. Nawang Rai came down from above them fast. He had been 15 meters ahead, testing the fixed line near the base of the bottleneck, and he descended with the speed of a man who had made decisions in bad weather before and knew how little time those decisions allowed. Yet he reached them at approximately 8,100 meters and told Richard in plain words that they were turning around. The summit was gone. The window was gone. They needed to move down immediately while they could still see the fixed ropes. Richard said no. He said the weather would pass. He said they were close. He said he had not come this far to turn around 200 meters below the summit. His voice was steady and certain and carried the full weight of a man who had spent 3 years making this plan and $78,000 executing it. Elena stood behind him and said nothing. She would say later, in a brief statement provided through her father's estate lawyer before her own death, that she had started to speak and then stopped. She wrote, "He looked so sure. He always looked so sure." Nawang told him again, and he told him the serac above the bottleneck was unstable in high wind. He told him the fixed lines above them might be buried within the hour. He told him that descending in a whiteout at 8,100 meters was dangerous but surviving. He told him that what was above them was not. Richard said they would wait 10 minutes and see if it cleared. It did not clear. It got worse. The wind went from strong to violent, and the temperature dropped sharply enough that Elena felt it through her downsuit, a sudden pressing cold against her chest. The fixed rope above them disappeared entirely in the drift. Nawang made the decision himself. He told them they were descending now. He clipped onto the line and looked back to make sure they were following. Richard followed. Elena came last. They had descended perhaps 30 meters when Richard lost the fixed line. He had unclipped briefly to pass an anchor, a standard move done 100 times on a climb like this, and in the whiteout, he reached for the line below the anchor and found nothing. He swept his arm in a wide arc. Nothing. The fixed rope had been buried under a wave of spindrift, and Richard Voss was standing at 8,070 meters on K2 in a complete whiteout without a connection to anything. Elena was still clipped to the line 2 meters above him. She saw what happened. She made her choice without hesitation. She unclipped from the fixed rope and moved to her father's side and took his arm. She would not find the line again for 11 minutes. Nawang came back up through the drift, moving by memory and feel along the buried rope. And he located it beneath the snow and got Richard clipped back on. 11 minutes at 8,000 meters in those conditions had cost them something they could not measure yet. They were still moving down when the sound came from above. It was not a crack or a boom the way people describe avalanches in films. It was a low, grinding pressure, like a building settling, and it lasted only 2 or 3 seconds before the ice debris came down the bottleneck in a fast, narrow fall. The main serac had not released. A portion of its lower face had calved, a section perhaps 12 meters wide, and what came down the gully was not a full avalanche, but it was enough. Richard was struck on the left side by a block of ice approximately the size of a car door, and the impact knocked him sideways off the fixed line, and he fell 4 meters before his instincts fired and he drove his ice axe into the slope. He stopped. Elena was already moving toward him before he stopped sliding. He could breathe. He told her he could breathe, but the pain in his left side was immediate and severe, and when he tried to stand fully upright, he could only manage a bent forward lean, and his pace going down was now less than half of what it had been. Nawang Rai later described to investigators what he saw. He was bending to protect something on his left side. The ribs, I thought. Maybe worse. He was still moving, but every step cost him. Elena's radio had taken the edge of the ice debris strike across its body. The transmit function was dead. She could hear base camp trying to reach them. She could hear the operations coordinator crackling through the static, but when she pressed the transmit button and spoke, nothing went out. She pressed it again and again. She listened to them call her name. She could not answer. They reached a small shoulder at approximately 8,010 meters as full darkness came down. Richard could not continue the descent in the dark with his injuries on that terrain. Nawang set a snow anchor and rigged a minimal shelter from their emergency bivouac gear, a thin reflective sheet pulled around all 3 of them, pressed against the slope. The temperature that night, according to weather station data reviewed by investigators, dropped to minus 47 degrees Celsius with wind chill. Richard's condition deteriorated through the night. He stopped shivering around 2 in the morning, which was not a good sign. Nawang pressed his body against Richard's and forced water from a bottle kept inside his suit. He kept talking to him. Elena sat with her father's head in her lap and talked to him about Pittsburgh. She talked about his workshop in the basement where he kept his engineering drawings. She talked about the summer he taught her to sail on a reservoir outside the city. She talked in the dark and the cold, and base camp continued to call her dead radio through the night, and at some point before dawn, Richard Voss stopped answering her. The base camp communications log shows Nawang Rai's transmission came in at 5:22 a.m. on July 29th. His voice was controlled, but the words were direct. He reported Richard Voss as deceased. He reported Elena as alive, but severely hypothermic and unable to walk independently. But he reported his own position as approximately 8,010 meters on the Abruzzi Spur, and said he needed extraction help as soon as weather permitted. The operations coordinator responded within 30 seconds. Then a new wave of the storm hit the mountain, and the connection went to static, and the log shows no further transmissions from that position for 4 hours. Nawang Rai's transmission reached base camp at 5:22 a.m., and by 5:30 a.m., Summit Bridge's operations team had already begun making calls. The first went to Pakistan Army Aviation's Rescue Coordination Unit in Skardu. The second went to other expedition teams on the mountain. The third went to a mountain rescue contractor Summit Bridge kept on retainer each season. The weather, as of 5:30 a.m., made all 3 responses the same. Wait, the storm was not finished. Young wind speeds at the summit were recorded at 87 kilometers per hour. The valley below base camp was socked in with cloud and blowing snow. The Pakistan Army pilot assigned to the rescue, Captain Faisal Durrani, reviewed conditions at first light and told his commanding officer he could not depart until the valley cleared. He was asked 3 times if he was certain. He said yes each time. On the mountain, Nawang Rai was not waiting. He rigged Elena into a makeshift harness using emergency gear and began lowering her down the slope in stages. At 8,000 meters, a human body has roughly 60% of the oxygen available at sea level. The simplest tasks become labored. The complex ones become nearly impossible. Nawang had been awake for over 24 hours and above 7,000 meters for more than 36. He began lowering her anyway. And two Balti high-altitude porters, Ghulam and Bashir, had been dispatched from Camp 3 at first light. They were not professional guides. They were load carriers who had worked K2's lower slopes for years, men who knew the mountain's rhythms the way farmers know weather. Ghulam later told investigators, "We knew from the radio traffic that someone above us needed help. You don't think about it, you just go." They reached Nawang and Elena at approximately 8:45 a.m. Elena was conscious but not coherent, answering questions with the wrong words, responding to her own name with a delay of several seconds. Nawang had used everything in his emergency kit. He had nothing left to give her. The descent from 8,010 meters to Camp 3 took 4 hours. Bashir stayed close to Elena the entire way, holding her upright when her legs failed. She asked about her father once during a rest. Bashir said later, "I told her Nawang was taking care of him. I could not tell her the truth on that slope." They reached Camp 3 at 12:55 p.m. Nawang began warming protocol immediately. Dry layers, oxygen at 4 liters per minute, hot liquid, body heat from all 3 of them pressed against Elena in the largest tent. Her core temperature began to rise. Her speech became slightly clearer. At 1:30 p.m., the valley cleared. Captain Durrani lifted off from Skardu at 2:10 p.m. His first 2 approaches to Camp 3 were aborted by wind. On the 3rd, he found a pause between gusts and held it long enough. Elena was lifted away from the slope at 3:41 p.m. At base camp, Dr. Anya Mirza described her condition on arrival. Her blood pressure was extremely low, severe frostbite on both hands and feet, multiple rib fractures. Her pulse was present but weak and irregular. I started rewarming immediately. The base camp communications log shows one final transmission from Elena that evening, relayed through Dr. Mirza at 6:50 p.m. Patient conscious, asking about father's status. Has been told he is being recovered. Emotional but stable. The next 12 hours would determine everything. Elena Voss died at 4:17 a.m. on July 30th, 2019, at the Summit Bridge Base Camp Medical Station at the foot of K2. Dr. Anya Mirza, who was present, recorded it plainly in her incident report. Cardiac arrest, unresponsive to resuscitation. Time of death 4:17. The official medical examiner's report, completed in Islamabad 3 weeks later, listed the cause of death as severe hypothermia compounded by hemothorax from multiple rib fractures, out with contributing factors of prolonged hypoxic exposure above 8,000 meters and advanced frostbite to all 4 extremities. Her heart, exhausted and cold and deprived of oxygen for too long, simply stopped. She was 34 years old. Pakistan's Alpine authorities completed their investigation in September 2019. They reached a finding of preventable fatality, citing deviation from established safety protocols and Summit Bridge Expedition's failure to communicate a critical weather advisory to their clients at Camp 4. That advisory is what made people angry. The Pakistan Meteorological Service had issued a high-risk weather alert at 11:08 p.m. on July 27th, the night before Richard and Elena left for the summit. The communications log confirmed that Summit Bridge's operations coordinator, Sohail Manzoor, had received it, opened it, and filed it without forwarding it to Camp 4. His explanation was that company policy passed weather advisories to field guides at the next scheduled check-in, which was 6 a.m. By 6 a.m., Richard and Elena had already been climbing for 2 hours. Manzoor said he had not considered the alert severe enough to justify a non-scheduled transmission. He said he had used his judgment. Investigators also found that Summit Bridge had quietly reduced their guide-to-client ratio that season from 1 guide per 2 clients to 1 guide per 4. Nawang Rai had been responsible for 4 clients. He managed the rescue he managed only because 2 of them had turned back sick at Camp 2. The report noted this without subtlety. Summit Bridge lost their operating permit for the 2020 season. They did not reapply. K2 has killed approximately 1 in every 4 climbers who have reached its summit. It is the most dangerous mountain on Earth per summit attempt. The case was entered into Pakistan's Mountaineering Incident Database as Fatality Event K2-2019-07 and cited in mandatory safety briefings issued to all Karakoram expedition operators the following season. Elena's phone was recovered from her jacket during the initial medical assessment at base camp. It was undamaged inside a dry bag in her chest pocket. The screen was cracked from the cold but still worked. Dr. Mirza turned it on and found one unsent message in the drafts folder, written at 4:58 a.m. on July 29th, while Elena was sitting on an open slope at 8,010 meters in the dark, her father's body beside her, waiting for dawn. It was addressed to her mother in Pittsburgh, and it read, "Dad made it." She didn't want to climb K2. She wanted to bring her father home. The mountain took them both, and the truest thing about this story is that she had every chance to turn back. She had Nawang's warnings, and Jürgen Albrecht's worried eyes, and her own careful instincts, all of them pointing down the mountain. She ignored every one of them, not for the summit, not for the photograph, not for the reasons climbers usually die up there. She ignored them for her father. Her love for him was the last thing that killed her, and K2 did not care about that at all.